On that note, any questions? Aaron, Ed? Go ahead.
I have several, but I'll start out with just one. One of the groups I've observed who is always tends to be more pro-illegal alien are Christian groups. When I spoke to a gentleman once who was attending one of the tea parties, and he went by his church where he was very active, and he noticed all these school buses lined out front. And he thought, oh, good, they're organizing buses to take us into the city. But when he went up to it, he found out up to his church where these school buses were lined up. Oddly enough, they were all full of the illegal aliens to be able to be driven onto the National Mall so they could protest for their own lives. And he was furious because here he was an active member of his church, and he had no indication whatsoever from the minister, or it was never put out in the Sunday bulletin, that they had this other activity that they were funding and organizing, and he was, very upset about this. So I'm curious about your observations, or was it in one of these reports studying those groups supporting this activity?
I mean, I have some thoughts on it. No, Stanley didn't address it, but my sense is that this is really just a playing out of the same elite public split that you see in every other institution. In other words, union leaders are for amnesty, union members are against it. Business leaders and big businesses are for amnesty, small businesses are against it. And you see the same thing with religious institutions. The Catholic bishops are for amnesty, ordinary Catholics aren't. And so it's just that among evangelical Protestants, I think there actually has been less of a gap between elite and public views, but we're now seeing that same thing happen. The National Association of Evangelicals has now backed amnesty. And so I think in other words, I don't think it's anything unique. I think it's the same pattern that you see in one institution after another, where the people on top favor essentially open borders. And I don't think that's an unfair assessment to describe it that way. And the public want controls of one kind or another. Even if people haven't thought it out in detail, but they want controlled immigration, and the people on the top don't. I mean, that's what it amounts to.
Yeah, and I particularly have seen this in I do a lot in the civil rights area, and I've particularly seen this with civil rights organizations. And one of the best examples is, frankly, the NAACP. The leadership of the NAACP is very much in favor of illegal immigration and providing amnesty. I could tell you, if you polled their ordinary, everyday members, they would not be. And this was dramatically shown to me about 2 months ago. The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, which was mentioned earlier, had a conference here in Washington on current and future civil rights issues. And this issue came up during the conference. And one of the speakers is a gentleman who was a counsel and speechwriter to Martin Luther King. And he did not have the view that most of the leadership of organizations like the NAACP said. I mean, he said, look, one of the biggest reasons for the unfortunate and very high unemployment rate in the black community is in America is because of illegal immigrants who come here and are willing to work for lower wages. They bring down wages, they take jobs, and he said, you want to help solve that employment problem, then enforce our immigration laws. And he had a very different view than you normally see from the kind of elites that occupy their offices in Washington, where they're headquartered.
May I have, before you go on to your next question, just a different angle on that. I'm a political scientist and an academic, and so I think in terms of the way things are conceptualized and ideas, and I'm a believer that reframing ideas and putting forward new ways of thinking about things can make a difference. It can get people to think about things in a way they haven't done before. And so I mentioned at the very beginning of my talk some work that I'm doing for CIS on trying to reframe the ethical and moral issues that go into immigration. And I think this is really very important because often what we get, if you mention the Catholics, for example, you get people who quote selectively from the Vatican, but there are lots of other quotes from the Pope himself on the right of states to determine their own immigration policies. They certainly want them to be humane, and they ought to be humane, but there's a difference there, and also the moral arguments about fairness or what you ought to do with strangers. So there's a whole moral set of arguments which are consistent with the kinds of things we'd like to see going on in the United States, but they're never made or articulated, and so people just really don't know that they're there to exist. The other minor point on this is that with the evangelicals, there's a guy by the name of Richard Lamb, I believe I have it. Land, whose name I have correct. He's been testifying before Congress about the importance of deriving amnesty from the Bible. But then he, in his testimony, makes a very interesting admission, which is, of course, they're in the business of saving souls. And there are no souls more in need of being saved than those coming into the United States, whether legally or illegally. So this is a growth group for religious leaders. And yet, now I'm not accusing him of anything. I'm simply stating the fact of what he said. And so I hope that in the future and in the near future, we'll be able to have an alternative framework for asking and answering those questions, which will allow people to have some perspective, let us say, on the nature of the issues involved.
Let me just read one quote that sort of relates to this issue of self-interestedness in immigration. Just a couple of days ago, an immigration lawyer's daily webzine had a little thing about why the immigration bar should be for the DREAM Act specifically. And their reason number 2 was, quote, "A not insignificant fraction of DREAM beneficiaries will need legal counsel, one of the few bright spots on the horizon for law firms suffering from the Great Recession," unquote. I mean, it's the most naked assessment of we're going to make money off of this. That, I mean, even the Landscapers and Nurserymen's Association isn't quite that blunt about the interest they have in immigration. Anyway, just one more, and because I want to respect people's time. You have another question?
Yeah.
Just one more, and then we got to cut it short.
But, all right, the other is, again, referring to Arizona and what Arizona's doing. And we're talking about the fact that that cross-section of American citizenry between here and San Francisco, they're not being heard, and that's been going on for a decade now, to the point where I think the citizenry out there recognize it and have long since been starting to address the issue at their own level, at the state, county, and local level. Thus, the introduction of all these various anti-immigration laws or more stringent enforcement laws in state legislatures. And as a consequence, I suspect, and I'd like your comments on this, that Middle America is looking to Arizona as the lead, the point of the spear when addressing this issue. And they've dismissed Capitol Hill because Capitol Hill and these wondrously elite, thoughtful think tanks here in the DC area put out these silly blue ribbon commissions. They've got a 10-year to them. They're not even including the citizens. They're not even hearing them. So the citizenry said, fine, you're not listening to us? Well, then we'll take the matter into our own hands. And therefore, that's why you see this kind of flurry of activity in the state capitals and Arizona.
Right. Yeah. Stanley, any
Well,
comments on that?
the one basic point I would say is that I love the Arizona law, not only for what it accomplishes. There's a lot of misinformation about it. People I was out with dinner last night were both of the opinion that the law required policemen to stop anybody on the street to ask them about their thing. These are informed people. This guy's at the head of the CIA on a national security stuff. This is what he thought, and his wife did too. I said, well, no, that's totally not right. At any rate,
maybe being involved with the CIA is
well,
good.
This is I'm
from
not naming
someone who would
names.
know.
But he's an informed guy. I mean, he's, he At any rate, what I like about the Arizona law is that it pierced the dome of silence. I wrote a paper for Mark about that. You know, wow, you could do something. You know, you're not awful if you pass this law. You're not, you know, beyond the pale. It's a reasonable thing to want to make sure that people who are there ought to be there. This is not, you know, Nazihood. And so, you know, that to me is the most striking part. And, you know, I think it'll have an effect, a ripple effect, because it gives people the sense of what is possible. That's what's really important about that to me.
Yeah, I mean, well, go ahead.
I agree, and the thing is, most people don't understand that the current Arizona law that's been such a content, that's their third law in this area, okay? In 2004, Arizonans passed in a referendum a law that requires you to provide proof of citizenship when you register to vote, because they had a problem with finding people who were not U.S. citizens who had registered and were voting in the state. Now, that was upheld at federal district court, because, you know, of course, the ACLU sued. It was upheld in the Ninth Circuit. It then went back down. It came back up in about 2 weeks ago. A 3-judge panel, unfortunately, threw the law out, said it was unconstitutional. I believe that is going to get overturned on when it gets to the U.S. Supreme Court. And we have the second law Arizona passed, which was a law punishing employers if they knowingly hire illegal aliens. That is before the Supreme Court now. It was upheld at the trial level. It was upheld in the Ninth Circuit, which is unusual. Ninth Circuit's the most liberal court in the country, and that was up for oral arguments 2 weeks ago in the Supreme Court. And it was a very odd situation, because that lawsuit actually was brought by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And who was supporting them in the lawsuit? Well, of course, the ACLU and other unions. But again, I think in that case, there's a good chance that Arizona's going to get upheld. And as those 3 laws hopefully get upheld in the higher courts, you're going to see states all over the country starting to pass similar laws, so that even if the federal government continues to lack the willpower to actually enforce our immigration laws, you're going to see states all over the country starting to supplement and help them do that.
Yeah, let me just make one last point on this. When they poll the public outside Arizona, you know, do you support the Arizona law? Or state legislators say, you know, we want to have an Arizona law. You know, the public doesn't know any more about it than Stanley's dinner companions as far as the specifics go. And they have much more reason to not know the specifics. But what they're saying, what the question they're answering, what they're hearing is, do you support SB 1070? What they're hearing is, do you want America's immigration laws
Yes.
enforced? And so when 60% or whatever it is back the Arizona law, people who live in, you know, Hawaii and New Jersey and whatever it is, what they're saying is, enforce the frickin' law. I mean, that's what those poll results suggest. And it really is a manifestation of that fundamental distrust that the public has for the elite on immigration, in a way that I think is not true on welfare policy necessarily, or crime policy, or tax policy, or other things, where I think that because that gap isn't as big, there isn't the same kind of fundamental distrust and disbelief in anything that comes out of the elite, including these kind of blue ribbon task forces. Well, let me cut it short there. Appreciate everybody who's coming, and this is online at CIS.org, and thanks for coming.
Thank you.